Sometimes the smallest piece of paper carries the heaviest truth. The boardroom on the 42nd floor of Holloway Global was built to impress. Floor-to-ceiling glass overlooked the Manhattan skyline. Polished walnut tables reflected the morning sunlight. A dozen executives sat in tailored suits, their tablets glowing with charts, forecasts, and projections worth billions of dollars. No one smiled. No one relaxed. Today was voting day. One signature would approve the largest acquisition in the company's history. Outside, rain streaked slowly down the windows, turning the city into a blur of silver and gray. Inside, every second felt expensive. Adrian Holloway sat at the head of the table, his Swiss watch catching a flash of light as he checked the time. 43 years old. Self-made billionaire. Respected. Feared. Admired. The kind of man whose decisions moved markets before breakfast. He adjusted his cufflink and glanced at the presentation screen. Everything was ready. Everything was under control. Or so he believed. "Shall we proceed with the final vote?" the chief legal officer asked. Adrian nodded once. Around the table, directors prepared their documents. Pens clicked. Pages turned. The familiar sounds of power. Then the door opened. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Just enough to interrupt the rhythm of the room. Several heads turned. A young woman stepped inside carrying a small leather folder. She wore a simple black server uniform. Nothing about her appearance belonged in a billion-dollar board meeting. For a moment, confusion replaced concentration. Security had cleared the floor hours ago. No visitors were scheduled. No staff members were expected. The woman moved calmly toward the table. Not nervous. Not rushed. Her posture remained steady despite the eyes now fixed upon her. Adrian frowned. He had never seen her before. Yet something about her face felt strangely familiar. She stopped beside him. The room grew quiet. Not polite quiet. Curious quiet. The kind that arrives before something important happens. The woman opened the leather folder and carefully removed a single sheet of paper. It wasn't a contract. It wasn't a report. It wasn't a legal document. It was a coffee receipt. Slightly worn. Folded at the edges. The paper looked almost insignificant against the polished table. She placed it gently in front of Adrian. "Sir," she said softly, "I think this belongs to you." A few executives exchanged puzzled looks. Someone almost laughed. Adrian looked down at the receipt. His expression didn't change at first. Then it did. Slowly. Almost imperceptibly. The color drained from his face. His fingers stopped moving. His eyes locked onto a handwritten note scrawled across the back of the receipt. For words. For simple words. Words nobody else in the room could see from where they sat. The silence deepened. The rain tapped softly against the glass. Somewhere in the distance, a siren echoed through the city. But inside the boardroom, nobody spoke. Because for the first time in years, Adrian Holloway looked completely unprepared. And as every executive watched their powerful CEO stare at a forgotten coffee receipt, they realized something was terribly wrong. The woman folded her hands in front of her and waited. Calm. Patient, unshaken, as though she had already known exactly what would happen the moment he saw it. And in that endless silence, the billion-dollar vote suddenly became the least important thing in the room. No one moved. No one even reached for a pen. The executives who had spent years negotiating mergers, acquisitions, and billion-dollar contracts sat frozen by a reaction they could not understand. Adrian Holloway continued staring at the receipt as though it had become the only object in the room. His thumb slowly brushed across the faded paper. The handwriting was unmistakable. He knew it immediately. The note had been written 3 months earlier. 3 months and 11 days, to be exact. The memory returned with uncomfortable clarity. A rainy Tuesday morning. A small cafe 2 blocks from corporate headquarters. Adrian had entered between meetings, distracted by phone calls and deadlines. He had barely looked at the young waitress who served him, barely noticed her polite smile, barely acknowledged the steaming cup placed on his table. Back then, Claire Whitmore was just another face in a crowded city. At least that was what Adrian had assumed. The room remained silent as Claire stood calmly beside him. Her expression revealed nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, no triumph, only patience. Across the table, the chief financial officer adjusted his glasses. "Adrian," he asked carefully. The CEO did not answer. He was no longer in the boardroom. His mind was somewhere else entirely. Back in that cafe. Back on that rainy morning. back to a conversation he had forgotten almost immediately afterward. A conversation that apparently Claire had not forgotten at all. The rain outside intensified, streaking the glass walls with silver lines. One executive glanced toward another, searching for answers. None came. Finally, Adrian lifted his eyes toward Claire. For the first time, he truly looked at her. Her blonde hair was neatly tied back. Her uniform was simple, unremarkable, yet there was something different now. Something he should have noticed before. Confidence. Quiet confidence. The kind that did not need attention. The kind that survived without approval. "Where did you get this?" Adrian asked. His voice sounded lower than usual. Claire answered softly. "You gave it to me." Several people around the table exchanged confused looks. Adrian swallowed. The response landed harder than anyone realized. Because he remembered. Not everything. Just enough. He remembered being impatient. He remembered taking a call while signing the receipt. He remembered scribbling something on the back before rushing out the door. At the time it had seemed meaningless. A random observation. A private thought. Nothing more. Yet somehow Claire had preserved it. Protected it. Carried it for months. "You kept it," Adrian said. Claire nodded once. "Some things are worth keeping." The words settled over the room. Short. Simple. Heavy. The board members sensed they were witnessing something far larger than a forgotten receipt. Something personal. Something dangerous. Something connected to the acquisition vote sitting untouched on the conference table. Claire glanced briefly toward the presentation screen, displaying charts and projections. Then she looked back at Adrian. "Before you approve this deal," she said quietly, "there is something you need to remember." A chill seemed to move through the room despite the climate-controlled air. Adrian lowered his gaze back to the faded paper. His heartbeat felt louder now, because suddenly he understood one thing with absolute certainty. Claire Whitmore had not come to interrupt the meeting. She had come to stop it. The directors looked at one another, waiting for someone to explain what was happening. No one could. The woman standing beside Adrian Holloway did not belong in their world. Yet somehow she had become the center of it. Claire remained composed while the executives shifted uneasily in their seats. She had spent months carrying this moment. Months deciding whether to walk away or step forward. Months wondering if the truth was worth the risk. Now she stood only a few feet from the most powerful man in the room, and for the first time, he was listening. Adrian leaned back slowly. The acquisition documents sat untouched before him. A few minutes earlier they had seemed urgent. Now they felt strangely distant. "What exactly am I supposed to remember?" he asked. Claire glanced toward the rain-covered windows. The city beyond them appeared soft and blurred beneath the storm clouds. 3 months ago," she said quietly, "you came into the cafe during a thunderstorm." Adrian said nothing. The memory was becoming clearer. He remembered the weather. He remembered being frustrated. A deal had nearly collapsed that morning. Investors had been demanding answers. Analysts were questioning forecasts. Every conversation had felt like another weight added to his shoulders. "You sat at the corner table," Claire continued. "The one near the window." Adrian nodded once. Around the boardroom, curiosity deepened. The chief legal officer folded his hands. The chief operating officer stopped checking his tablet. Even the assistants standing near the wall remained perfectly still. Claire reached into the leather folder and removed a second piece of paper. This one was older, creased from being folded and unfolded many times. She placed it beside the receipt. Adrian immediately recognized his own handwriting. Smaller. Messier. Written in haste. His chest tightened. "I was serving coffee that morning," Claire said. "You were talking to someone on the phone. You did not realize anyone could hear you." Adrian stared at the note. Fragments of memory surfaced. Numbers. Concerns. Questions about missing projections. Doubts he had shared with almost no one. "After you ended the call," Claire continued, "you wrote down 4 questions." The room remained silent. Questions about the company. Adrian looked up at her. "And you kept them?" Claire nodded. Because they were the right questions. Several board members exchanged uncertain glances. Adrian lowered his eyes again. The questions written on the paper suddenly felt familiar. Painfully familiar. He remembered asking them. He remembered never receiving satisfactory answers. Then the acquisition opportunity appeared. Attention shifted. Priorities changed. Deadlines accelerated. The questions were forgotten. Or perhaps ignored. Claire spoke gently. "You wrote those questions because something did not make sense." Adrian felt a knot forming in his stomach. "What are you saying?" Claire met his gaze directly. I am saying that the same thing that worried you 3 months ago is hidden inside the deal you are about to approve today. The words settled over the boardroom like a heavy fog. Nobody interrupted. Nobody challenged her. Because for the first time that morning, several executives were beginning to wonder whether the waitress standing beside their CEO understood something they had all missed. Adrian slowly lifted the second sheet of paper. The rain continued tapping against the glass walls, soft but relentless, like a reminder that some things refuse to be ignored forever. His eyes moved across the handwritten questions. The ink had faded slightly, but every word remained clear. Question 1 concerned unexplained revenue growth inside a subsidiary division. Question 2 challenged a series of unusually timed asset transfers. Question 3 focused on projected earnings that seemed too perfect. Question 4 asked the simplest question of all. Who benefits if everyone stops asking questions? Adrian remembered writing them. He remembered the feeling that morning, the uneasiness, the instinct that something beneath the numbers did not fit. For more than 20 years, his instincts had built an empire. Yet somewhere along the way, deadlines, headlines, and investor expectations had become louder than intuition. Claire watched him quietly. She did not need to speak. The paper was doing the work for her. Across the table, Richard Mercer, the chairman of the acquisition committee, shifted in his seat. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but Claire noticed. Adrian noticed too. These concerns were reviewed months ago, Richard said, forcing a thin smile. Our auditors cleared everything. Claire turned toward him. Did they? The question sounded calm, respectful even. Yet something in her tone made several executives glance toward Richard. The chairman adjusted his tie. Of course they did. Claire nodded slowly. Interesting. She reached into her folder again. This time she removed several printed pages. Financial summaries. Public filings. Earnings reports. Nothing confidential. Nothing dramatic. Just information anyone could access if they cared enough to look. I work mornings at the cafe, she said. Most afternoons, I help at the public library across town. Several executives looked confused. Adrian remained silent. 3 months ago, Claire continued, those questions stayed in my mind. They bothered me. So I started reading. She placed the documents on the table. 1 report became 2. 2 became 20. Then 50. The chief financial officer leaned forward. Despite himself, he seemed interested. Claire pointed to several highlighted figures. Every answer created another question. Adrian studied the pages. The numbers looked familiar. Fragments from different reports. Different quarters. Different divisions. Harmless individually. Uncomfortable together. Claire continued. At first I assumed I was wrong. She smiled faintly. After all, I serve coffee for a living. No one laughed. But numbers do not care about job titles. The room grew even quieter. Richard's expression hardened. With respect, Miss Whitmore, reading public reports does not qualify someone to challenge an acquisition reviewed by teams of professionals. Claire met his gaze. That is true. Richard appeared relieved. Then she added, which is why I did not rely on my opinion. She slid 1 final document across the table. Adrian looked down. His eyes narrowed immediately. The page contained a comparison chart. For simple columns. For years of financial data. One pattern. Repeated again and again. Hidden in plain sight. The same pattern connected directly to the concerns he had written on the back of that forgotten receipt months earlier. His heartbeat quickened. Because for the first time, the pieces were beginning to fit together. And the picture they formed was not reassuring. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The comparison chart lay in the center of the table like a mirror nobody wanted to look into. Adrian studied the highlighted figures again. Revenue spikes. Asset transfers. Forecast adjustments. Each event seemed ordinary on its own. Together, they formed a rhythm. Predictable. Repeated. Intentional. His jaw tightened. He had spent his career recognizing patterns before competitors did. Yet this one had slipped past him. Or perhaps he had been too busy to see it. Claire remained standing quietly beside the table. She did not appear triumphant. If anything, she looked tired. As though carrying this information had become a burden she no longer wanted to carry alone. Richard Mercer leaned forward. Coincidences happen in financial reporting. His voice was controlled, but the confidence from earlier had faded. You are creating a narrative from unrelated data points. Claire nodded politely. That is exactly what I thought at first. She reached into the folder once more. Until I found this. Another document appeared. This one was older than the others. The paper showed signs of age. Fold marks crossed the page. The corners had softened from years of handling. Adrian immediately noticed the date at the top. For years earlier. Long before the acquisition being discussed today. Long before most people in the room had even considered the current deal. The chief financial officer adjusted his glasses and leaned closer. Where did you find that? Claire glanced toward him. The public library archives. A few executives exchanged surprised looks. The public library? Someone repeated. Claire smiled faintly. Information does not become less true because it is stored on a dusty shelf. Adrian looked at the page. It was an industry report from years ago. Buried deep inside were warnings about a network of companies moving assets through complex partnerships. Legal, technical, difficult to track. The names were different. The corporations were different. Yet the financial pattern looked almost identical to the one sitting in front of them today. Adrian felt something uncomfortable settle into his chest. Not fear. Not yet. Recognition. You followed the pattern backward, he said quietly. Claire nodded. And forward. She slid another page onto the table. This one contained projections extending 3 years into the future. Several executives immediately frowned. The numbers looked dramatically different from the official forecasts included in the acquisition package. These projections assume the pattern continues, Claire explained. If it does, the company we are acquiring is worth far less than everyone believes. Silence returned. Heavy silence. The kind that grows when certainty begins to disappear. Adrian glanced around the room. Hours earlier, every director had expected a routine vote. Now nobody seemed eager to sign anything. Richard cleared his throat. This is speculation. Claire met his eyes calmly. Then it should be easy to disprove. Richard opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. No answer came. The rain outside continued falling across Manhattan. Soft. Steady. Unavoidable. Adrian lowered his gaze to the forgotten receipt beside the documents. Months ago, he had written 4 questions. Then he had walked away. Claire had not. And as he looked at the growing stack of evidence spread across the polished boardroom table, one realization became impossible to ignore. The waitress had spent more time investigating his concerns than anyone inside his own company. Adrian slowly stood from his chair. The movement alone changed the atmosphere of the room. For years, people had watched him rise before making decisions that shaped companies, careers, and fortunes. Today felt different. Today he was not standing because he had reached a conclusion. He was standing because certainty had abandoned him. He walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out at the rain-covered skyline. Far below, traffic moved through Manhattan like streams of light. The city never stopped. Neither had he. For more than 2 decades, he had built his reputation on speed. Faster decisions. Faster growth. Faster execution. Yet standing there now, he found himself wondering whether speed had become his weakness. Behind him, the boardroom remained silent. Claire did not speak. She understood something many executives never learned. Sometimes silence was more powerful than argument. Adrian turned back toward the table. How long? He asked. Claire looked at him. How long what? How long have you been working on this? Her answer came immediately. 93 days. Several directors exchanged surprised glances. 93 days. Not a week in curiosity. Not a random observation. 93 days of effort. 93 days of reading reports, comparing filings, and following questions nobody else seemed interested in asking. Adrian nodded slowly. Why? Claire looked down at the receipt resting beside the documents. Because I remembered what you wrote. The answer confused several people in the room. Adrian understood it immediately. She was not talking about the numbers. She was talking about the questions. Questions revealed character. Questions revealed priorities. Questions revealed what a person truly cared about when nobody was watching. Most people would have thrown that receipt away, Adrian said. Claire smiled faintly. Most people would. A soft laugh escaped from one of the independent directors before quickly fading. The tension remained. Richard Mercer folded his arms. Even if her concerns deserve review, we cannot delay a transaction of this size because of theories. Adrian turned toward him. Theories. Richard hesitated. That is not what I meant. Then tell me what you meant. The chairman shifted in his seat. For the first time all morning, he seemed uncomfortable. Adrian returned to the table and picked up the projection sheet Claire had provided. The figures stared back at him. Quiet. Unemotional. Numbers never cared about pride. They never cared about titles. They simply waited for someone willing to read them honestly. Claire watched him carefully. She remembered another rainy morning months ago. A man sitting alone at a cafe table. A cold cup of coffee. A distracted conversation. A forgotten receipt. Back then, Adrian Holloway had looked like someone carrying the weight of an empire. Today, he looked like someone carrying the weight of a realization. The difference mattered. Because deep down, Claire knew the real issue was no longer the acquisition. The real issue was trust. Trust in the reports. Trust in the process. Trust in the people sitting around that polished table. And as Adrian looked from the documents to the faces surrounding him, a question quietly formed in his mind. If a waitress had been willing to spend 93 days searching for the truth, why had no one else done the same? The question lingered in the air long after Adrian spoke it aloud. Nobody answered. Nobody could. The directors around the table suddenly found themselves studying papers, adjusting glasses, checking screens that no longer seemed important. Avoiding eye contact had become easier than explaining silence. Claire noticed it immediately. People often revealed themselves most clearly when they had nothing left to say. Adrian remained standing. His attention moved slowly around the room. One face at a time. One executive after another. For years, he had trusted these people. He had promoted them, defended them, rewarded them. Together, they had built one of the most successful corporations in the country. Yet a strange distance now existed between them. A distance measured not in feet, but in unanswered questions. The rain outside continued falling. Steady, patient, unconcerned with billion-dollar decisions. Finally, the chief financial officer cleared his throat. Perhaps we should postpone the vote for a few days. The suggestion would have sounded reasonable an hour earlier. Now it sounded desperate. Adrian looked at him carefully. A few days? The executive nodded. Enough time to review everything. Adrian said nothing. Claire remained still. She had expected resistance. What surprised her was how quickly the room had shifted from certainty to caution. Richard Mercer leaned forward. That would be the responsible approach. Adrian turned toward him. Interesting. Richard forced a smile. What is? 3 hours ago, you wanted the vote completed before lunch. Richard's expression tightened. Circumstances have changed. Adrian slowly nodded. They certainly have. He returned to his seat, but did not touch the acquisition documents. Instead, he picked up the old receipt again. The paper seemed absurdly small compared to the importance everyone had suddenly assigned to it. A forgotten receipt. A cold cup of coffee. A few handwritten questions. Strange how life worked. Sometimes the biggest warnings arrived, disguised as ordinary moments. Claire watched him study the faded ink. She remembered exactly where she had been standing that rainy morning. She remembered refilling water glasses, wiping tables, hearing a man question numbers that nobody else seemed willing to question. Most customers left tips. Adrian had left questions. She had spent 93 days chasing answers. One of the independent directors leaned forward. Miss Whitmore. Claire looked up. Yes. What made you keep going? The room grew quiet again. Claire considered the question. Because every time I found an answer, it created a bigger question. The director nodded slowly. Claire continued. And because nobody else seemed interested. Her voice remained calm. No accusation. No bitterness. Somehow that made the words land even harder. Adrian lowered his eyes. The statement bothered him because it was true. Somewhere between quarterly targets and shareholder expectations, curiosity had disappeared from the room. Questions had become obstacles instead of tools. Assumptions had replaced investigation. Trust had replaced verification. Outside, thunder rolled softly over the city. Not loud, just enough to be heard. Adrian glanced toward the dark sky beyond the windows, then back to the people around him. And for the first time that morning, a realization settled into place. The greatest risk facing Holloway Global was no longer the acquisition itself. It was the possibility that everyone had stopped asking the questions that mattered most. The boardroom clock ticked softly on the far wall. It was a small sound, yet somehow everyone could hear it now. Time felt different when certainty disappeared. Adrian rested both hands on the table and looked once more at the collection of documents Claire had assembled. 93 days of effort sat before him. 93 days from a woman who owed the company nothing. The realization refused to leave him. One of the senior directors finally broke the silence. Miss Whitmore, there is something I do not understand. Claire turned toward him. What is that? Most people would have taken these concerns to a journalist, a regulator, or a competitor. Why bring them here? Several heads nodded. It was a fair question. Claire lowered her eyes briefly toward the faded receipt. Because the questions belonged to him. She glanced toward Adrian. I thought he deserved the chance to answer them himself. The room became quiet again. Adrian felt the weight of those words settle heavily on his shoulders. She had trusted him with information that could have easily been used against him. In a world where loyalty often carried a price tag, the gesture felt unusually rare. Richard Mercer leaned back in his chair. Or perhaps she enjoys the attention. The comment sounded casual, almost harmless, yet something about it felt sharp. Claire did not react. She simply looked at him, calmly, patiently, the same way she had looked at every difficult question that crossed her path over the past 3 months. If I wanted attention, she said softly, I would not have spent 93 days sitting alone in library archives. A few directors looked down to hide faint smiles. Richard's expression hardened. Adrian noticed. More importantly, he noticed how quickly Richard wanted the conversation to move away from the evidence. Tell me something, Claire, Adrian said. When did you realize this might be bigger than a reporting error? Claire answered immediately. She had clearly thought about that moment many times. Day 31. Adrian raised an eyebrow. That specific? She nodded. I found the same group of consulting firms appearing around multiple transactions. Different names, different industries. Same pattern. She reached into the folder and removed one final sheet. Unlike the others, this page contained only a handful of company names connected by thin lines. Simple, easy to understand, dangerous in its simplicity. Several executives leaned forward. Adrian's eyes narrowed. He recognized 2 of the firms immediately. Both had participated in preliminary reviews for the acquisition. Who prepared this? Asked the chief legal officer. I did, Claire replied. Using publicly available records. The attorney examined the page more carefully. The confidence on his face began to fade. Adrian noticed that too. Outside, the rain slowly began to weaken. The clouds over Manhattan remained dark, but small streaks of light were beginning to appear between them. Inside the boardroom, however, the atmosphere only grew heavier. Because for the first time all morning, the discussion was no longer about whether there was a problem. The discussion was becoming about how many people already knew it existed. No one reached for the acquisition documents anymore. They remained untouched near the center of the table, as though the paper itself had become too heavy to lift. The atmosphere inside the boardroom had shifted again. Earlier there had been confidence, then doubt. Now there was something more unsettling. Awareness. Adrian studied the diagram Claire had assembled. A handful of consulting firms. Several transactions. Multiple layers of connections. Nothing illegal appeared on the surface. Nothing obvious. Yet the repetition bothered him. The pattern felt too precise. Too consistent. Like footprints hidden beneath fresh snow. Who else has seen this? Adrian asked. Claire shook her head. No one. Not even a journalist? No, not even a regulator. No, Adrian held her gaze for several seconds. He believed her. What surprised him was that he did. In his world, information was currency. People traded it, leveraged it, sold it. Yet Claire had spent 3 months gathering evidence without trying to profit from any of it. The realization felt increasingly rare. Across the table, the chief legal officer continued reviewing the chart. His expression had become noticeably more serious. There is something else, he said quietly. Several heads turned toward him. He pointed to one of the consulting firms listed on Claire's page. This company reviewed part of our due diligence package. The room became still. Richard Mercer immediately responded. That proves nothing. The attorney nodded. Perhaps. Then he pointed to a second firm. This one reviewed another section. Silence. A third company. And this one advised the target company. The silence deepened. Adrian watched the exchange without speaking. He was listening carefully now. Not just to words. To reactions. To timing. To discomfort. People often revealed more through hesitation than conversation. Claire remained beside the table. Calm. Patient. She had already walked this road alone. The executives were only beginning the journey. One of the directors leaned back and removed his glasses. If these relationships are accurate, why were they not disclosed? No one answered immediately. Richard folded his arms. Because there is nothing unusual about firms working across multiple projects. The explanation sounded reasonable, yet somehow it landed differently now. Questions were no longer being dismissed as easily as before. Adrian slowly picked up the receipt once more. His thumb rested against the faded paper. Months ago, he had written 4 questions. Today, every answer seemed to create 4 more. He almost smiled at the irony. The woman everyone would have overlooked had become the only person willing to keep asking. A flash of sunlight briefly pierced the clouds outside, reflecting across the glass walls of the boardroom. The rain was finally beginning to break. Claire noticed it. Adrian noticed it too. Strange how storms worked. They always seemed endless until the first sign of light appeared. Then Adrian's phone vibrated on the table. The sound cut through the room like a bell. He glanced at the screen. A message from the Internal Audit Department. Requested documents have been located. Preliminary findings attached. Adrian stared at the notification. Slowly, he looked up at Claire, then back at the screen. Because for the first time that morning, evidence was no longer coming from a waitress alone. It was coming from inside his own company. Every eye in the room shifted toward Adrian's phone. The notification remained glowing on the screen, small and silent, yet somehow more powerful than any presentation slide that had appeared all morning. Adrian unlocked the message. The attached report loaded slowly. Nobody spoke while he read. The chief financial officer leaned forward. The chief legal officer removed his glasses and waited. Even Richard Mercer remained unusually still. Adrian's eyes moved across the first page, then the second, then the third. With each page, the expression on his face changed. Not dramatically, not visibly enough for most people to notice. But Claire noticed. The tension in his jaw, the slight narrowing of his eyes, the way his fingers stopped moving altogether. Those were the signs of a man discovering something he did not want to find. Finally, Adrian lowered the phone onto the table. The room remained silent. The audit team found discrepancies, he said. His voice was calm, too calm. Several transactions were categorized differently in separate reports. No one reacted immediately. The words themselves sounded technical, ordinary, but everyone in the room understood what they meant. Numbers were supposed to tell one story. When they started telling different stories, something was wrong. Richard cleared his throat. That could be a clerical issue. Adrian looked directly at him. Across multiple years? Richard said nothing. Adrian picked up the phone again and continued reading. The audit department also identified consulting relationships that were not fully disclosed during preliminary reviews. This time, several directors exchanged uneasy glances. The chief legal officer slowly exhaled. How many relationships? Adrian looked at the report. More than a dozen. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Claire remained standing beside the table. She felt no satisfaction, only relief. For 93 days, she had worried that she might be mistaken. 93 days wondering if she had connected dots that were never meant to connect. Now the company itself was confirming what she had found. Adrian set the phone down once more. He looked at the old receipt resting beside the audit report. One piece of paper had started this entire chain of events. A forgotten note written during a rushed morning. For questions, for concerns, for instincts he had ignored. Outside, the clouds continued breaking apart. Small patches of blue sky were beginning to appear above the city. Sunlight reflected across neighboring buildings, scattering brightness through the boardroom windows. The change was subtle, yet impossible to miss. Adrian slowly stood again. Every director watched him. Every executive waited. The acquisition vote was still scheduled. The documents were still prepared. The signatures were still missing. But everyone already sensed what was coming. Adrian looked around the table, then toward Claire. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The billionaire and the waitress. The most powerful person in the room and the person nobody had expected to enter it. Then Adrian nodded once. Not a gesture of victory. Not a gesture of defeat. A gesture of acknowledgement. Because the truth had finally arrived. And no one in the boardroom could pretend not to see it anymore. For several seconds, nobody moved. The boardroom felt suspended in time, balanced between what everyone had believed and what they were beginning to understand. Adrian remained standing at the head of the table. The sunlight now reached across the polished wood surface, illuminating the scattered reports, the audit findings, and the worn receipt that had started it all. He looked around the room slowly, not as a chief executive addressing subordinates, as a man searching for honesty. The vote is suspended, he said at last. No one objected. That silence alone said more than any argument could have. Several directors lowered their eyes. Others quietly exhaled, as though they had been holding their breath for hours. Richard Mercer remained motionless. His expression was controlled, but the confidence that had once surrounded him seemed noticeably thinner. Adrian turned toward the chief legal officer. I want an independent review of every transaction connected to this acquisition. The attorney nodded immediately. It will begin today. Adrian continued. External auditors. External counsel. No exceptions. Another nod. Another quiet agreement. The room was no longer resisting questions. It was demanding them. Claire watched from beside the table. She had imagined this moment many times during the previous 93 days. Yet it felt strangely different from what she expected. There was no dramatic confrontation. No celebration. No sense of triumph. Only a quiet correction. Like a ship changing course before reaching dangerous water. One of the independent directors looked toward Claire. You never answered something. Claire turned. What is that? How did you learn to analyze financial statements like this? Several people looked up. It was the first question of the day directed toward her personally rather than the evidence. Claire hesitated briefly. My father taught accounting at a community college. Her voice softened slightly. When I was young, he used to leave textbooks around the house. I read them because I was curious. A few faint smiles appeared around the room. Later, she continued, I studied economics for 2 years before family circumstances changed. She stopped there. No elaborate explanation. No request for sympathy. Adrian noticed that as well. She never seemed interested in making herself the story. Even now. Even after everything. The chief financial officer looked at the stack of reports she had assembled. You did all of this on your own? Claire nodded. 1 page at a time. The answer lingered in the room. 1 page at a time. Not brilliance. Not luck. Persistence. Adrian found himself staring at the receipt again. Months ago, he had walked out of a cafe and forgotten about a few handwritten questions. Claire had carried them forward. Protected them. Followed them wherever they led. Outside, the storm had finally passed. Blue sky now stretched between the buildings of Manhattan. The city looked brighter than it had that morning. Inside the boardroom, Adrian slowly folded the receipt and placed it carefully inside his jacket pocket. Not because it was valuable, because it mattered. Because sometimes the most important documents were not contracts or reports. Sometimes they were reminders. And as he looked toward Claire Whitmore, Adrian realized that the greatest lesson of the day had nothing to do with finance at all. It was about paying attention to the people everyone else overlooks. The meeting ended differently than anyone had expected. There was no vote, no celebration, no announcement to investors. One by one, the directors gathered their papers and quietly left the boardroom. Conversations that normally filled the hallways were replaced by thoughtful silence. People who had arrived believing they understood everything were leaving with far more questions than answers. Adrian remained behind. So did Claire. For a moment, neither spoke. The vast room that had felt crowded all morning now seemed almost peaceful. Sunlight poured through the glass walls, washing away the gray shadows left by the storm. Adrian looked out across Manhattan. The city appeared unchanged. Yet somehow he felt different. You could have walked away, he said finally. Claire stood near the window, her hands resting lightly against the leather folder she had carried for 93 days. I thought about it. Adrian nodded. He believed that too. Why did you not? Claire smiled faintly. Because questions do not disappear just because we stop asking them. The answer lingered in the quiet room. Adrian laughed softly. Not because it was funny. Because it was true. For years he had built a reputation as a man who solved problems. Yet somewhere along the way, he had become surrounded by people whose job was to provide answers quickly. Fewer and fewer people challenged assumptions. Fewer and fewer people asked difficult questions. And then a waitress had walked into his life carrying more curiosity than an entire boardroom. Adrian turned toward her. Do you know what surprises me most? Claire shook her head. You never asked for anything. Claire looked genuinely confused. What would I ask for? Adrian smiled. Most people in his position would have had a long list ready. A promotion, a reward, a consulting contract, recognition, attention. Claire seemed interested in none of those things. Nothing, Adrian admitted. That is exactly my point. Claire glanced toward the city beyond the glass. My father used to say that truth is valuable because it does not belong to anyone. Adrian thought about that. then about the receipt folded safely inside his jacket pocket, then about the questions written on the back. Your father sounds wise. Claire's eyes softened. He was. The room fell quiet once more. Comfortable this time. Not tense. Not uncertain. Just quiet. Eventually, Adrian reached into his pocket and carefully removed the old receipt. He studied it one final time before placing it on the table between them. The paper looked ordinary. Small. Forgettable. Yet both of them understood that sometimes ordinary things changed everything. Adrian looked at Claire. You know, he said, I almost threw this away. Claire smiled. Most people would have. Sunlight reflected across the polished wood table. Outside, the clouds had completely cleared. And for the first time that day, Adrian realized the company had not been saved by a report, an audit, or a board meeting. It had been saved by someone who refused to ignore a question simply because everyone else did. 6 months later, the boardroom looked very different. The acquisition had been permanently canceled after an independent review confirmed the concerns hidden inside the financial structure. New oversight policies had been introduced. Reporting systems had been rebuilt. Questions were no longer treated as obstacles. They had become part of the culture again. Several executives privately admitted that the company had avoided one of the most expensive mistakes in its history. Yet the most remarkable change could not be measured on a balance sheet. It could be felt. Adrian Holloway noticed it every morning when he walked into headquarters. People spoke more honestly. Meetings lasted longer but produced better decisions. Younger employees felt comfortable challenging assumptions. The organization had become stronger, not because it had found all the answers, but because it had learned the value of asking better questions. On the top floor of the building, inside Adrian's office, a simple frame sat on a shelf beside awards worth millions of dollars. Visitors often assumed it contained an important contract or a historic company document. It did not. Inside the frame rested a faded coffee receipt. Nothing more. Nothing less. Adrian never explained it unless someone asked. And when they did, he usually smiled and said the same thing. It reminds me to pay attention. Across the city, Claire Whitmore continued living a life that looked surprisingly similar to the one she had before. She still worked at the cafe several mornings each week. She still volunteered at the library. She still carried books home under her arm and spent quiet evenings reading. Adrian had offered consulting positions, executive opportunities, more than once. Claire had thanked him and politely declined. She was not interested in titles. She never had been. What mattered to her was knowing that she had done the right thing. One rainy afternoon, Adrian stopped by the cafe. The lunch crowd had thinned. Soft jazz played through the speakers. Claire was wiping down a table near the window. The same window where he had once sat months earlier, distracted and impatient, writing questions on the back of a receipt. How is the coffee? Claire asked with a small smile as she placed a fresh cup in front of him. Adrian looked at the steaming mug and laughed quietly. Much better when I actually pay attention to it. Claire smiled. Neither mentioned the boardroom. Neither mentioned the investigation. Some stories did not need repeating. Outside, rain tapped gently against the glass. Inside, two people sat in comfortable silence. Not because there was nothing left to say, because the important things had already been understood. Sometimes dignity does not arrive with applause. Sometimes wisdom does not wear an expensive suit. Sometimes the person who changes everything is the one nobody notices at first. And sometimes a simple question can save more than money. It can save perspective. It can save character. It can save a future. The quiet ones are never truly ordinary. If this story stayed with you, share the moment that touched you most in the comments, and subscribe for more stories about the unexpected people who remind us what truly matters.